Hello, everybody. I'm assuming that everyone can hear me. Great, thanks, Leanne. It's 12:00. Perfect, thank you. It's 12:04 now, so we might get going. My name is Rebecca Finn. I'm the current Joint President of the Urban Design Forum. Firstly, as we get started, I would like to acknowledge that I'm sitting on lands of the Wurundjeri people here in central Melbourne. But I recognise that the 200 or so people who signed up for this webinar are calling in from all over Victoria and Australia. So we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all of these lands and pay respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. So I'm very pleased to see so many people here today, seeing the names flick up on the screen as you all came in. The launch of this practice note on floor area ratios and the presentation today by Leanne Hodyl is a very big deal for the Urban Design Forum. Practice notes are something that the UDF has aspired to for many years, so we're so thrilled to see this one come to fruition. Without question, Leanne Hodyl is a shining light in this space and, may I say, our urban design profession generally. I have had the privilege of reading the practice note, and I'm certain that it will become a go-to document and a how-to guide to FARs in Victoria and across the country in the months and years to come. So thank you, Leanne, for your leadership and your hours and hours of time invested in this. And thank you also to the supporting UDF team of volunteers who have absolutely made this happen, Kim Delbridge in particular. So that's it from me for now. I will look forward to the discussion following Leanne's presentation, and I will now hand over to Kim Delbridge.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. So if you didn't already know, Urban Design Forum is a team of volunteers, and for a team of volunteers, we punch well above our weight. And the piece of work that Leanne's going to go through today is just one example of the output of our group. And your support goes a long way into producing this high quality work. So thank you for being here today, joining us for this session. And if you're not already a member of the Urban Design Forum, please do consider joining us either as an individual or as a supporting organization, because you'll help us to produce more like this. Our reach as an organization is growing very quickly. Just compared to the past year, we've probably gone up 20 to 30% in all the statistics you see there. And I think it's just because we're a group of like-minded people, and we've really found a home with this organization. Great, so I'm excited to introduce our first ever practice note with Leanne Hodyl. And I guess your first question is, what is a practice note? Well, it's a document which explains the best practice guidance for any given topic. So this one with Leanne Hodyl is looking at FARs, but in the future we hope to release more documents as well, so we can raise awareness as a collective organization and improve the standards of design across the industry. So you probably already know Leanne quite well. She's the lead author of this document. She's extremely experienced. She's built an entire company from scratch. She's a trusted advisor to the industry, the government, and the broader community. And you'll see when she goes through this document that the thinking behind this is deep, but the way it's presented is very succinct and clear, and so that anyone can pick up this piece of work and I think be an expert by the end of it. So as well as Leanne, there's been obviously a bunch of people contributing to this work. I also want to give a shout out to Ben Thorpe, the previous committee member who was working with Leanne to deliver this project, and also Shubra Cancel, who also worked on the graphics you'll see in this document as well. So over to you, Leanne.
Thanks very much, Kim. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us here today. And thanks very much for the generous introduction, Beck and Kim as well. So this is a little while coming. I think a number of you will have heard this, the talk, the practice note mentioned over the last couple of years. So it's a real absolute delight to actually reach this milestone and be able to share the work with you today. I also would like to acknowledge a lot of people because this practice note is really the combination of about a decade of research and ideas that I have been working on through peer review, collaboration and conversations. And I'm not going to read these names, but these are key people who have informed the work, and you'll see some of them credited through the work as well, where some of the work has been developed together. And also to thank the Urban Design Forum committee members over the last couple of years for their role, and particularly, as Kim said, Kim and Ben. So thank you. So I guess for me, this is also a very important moment in time, because I've obviously been working on built form controls and the importance of designing good neighbourhoods and good cities for quite a long time. And as many of you know, I've also been a key advocate for using FARs in a number of contexts across Melbourne and Victoria more broadly. And it's really clear to me that for particularly practitioners in Victoria, this is an unfamiliar tool and an unfamiliar concept. And so the opportunity to document a guide, a practice note on what FARs are and why we need them and how do they work is really both satisfying, but I think really important work to help build the literacy of this very extremely useful tool that we're less familiar with in Victoria. Importantly, and obviously I'm an urban designer, my focus is largely on design, but what this practice note does, it actually unpacks the complex relationships between a number of factors that really influence the cities that we get. So the relationships between development feasibility, design quality and planning assessment, and how these all interact together to either support or hinder housing supply and quality living environments. How do we optimise both of those things? And the practice note also seeks to demonstrate why these are a very commonly used tool across Australia and globally as an effective way to manage these relationships. I really wanted to make clear right at the beginning, fundamentally, an FAR control is simply a tool. I think there's sometimes a bit of, sometimes it's curiosity, sometimes it's mysticism, or perhaps skepticism about what FARs are and what they can deliver. They're a tool just like other planning mechanisms. And like all tools, really what matters is the intent, why you're using them, the judgment, how you're using them, and the skill brought to its use. How are they executed in a place to make sure that they deliver what you're trying to achieve. So what are we trying to achieve? Well, I don't think any of this is up for debate. I think it's very clear that we're trying to achieve more housing supply. We're trying to achieve good quality places that people want to live in, both at an apartment and at a neighbourhood and city scale. We're trying to deliver more efficient building forms. There's been obviously a lot of discussion around development feasibility and some of the concerns with previous controls that they don't necessarily support feasible and sustainable buildings. So that's a really key thing if we want to deliver more housing and more environmentally sound cities. We're trying to deliver more affordable housing, particularly social housing, to create more equitable cities. And we're really trying to deter speculative development and reward developers who want to deliver, who want to actually build, not those who might be seeking profits rather than delivery of housing in a new place. So what are we getting? Well, my observation and my experience through the last 15 years of developing built form controls and working as an urban designer in a range of different urban contexts is we're getting, through the use of largely discretionary building envelope controls, some really mixed outcomes. And that includes incoherent development patterns, both overdevelopment of some sites, underdevelopment of others. Our planning scheme is heavily focused on, I think, individual site scale and that assessment scale, and we're not giving enough attention to the neighbourhood scale. We're getting high degrees of development speculation, which is fueling land price instability. We're getting a lack of neighbourhood benefits at this neighbourhood scale, such as parks and pedestrian links. We're not getting social housing through a value capture mechanism more broadly, and we're also getting poor design outcomes, particularly as developers seek to maximise floor area to outbid other developers, and that's the start of the process that then flows through as they then continue to design and seek planning approvals. the graphic on the slide here you can see is in the practice note. That's one of the case studies that's in the document that sort of captures the different outcomes you get from the different set of planning controls, which I'll talk to a little bit more later. So the practice note itself is in 5 parts. It walks the reader through an overall introduction, why the practice note exists and what it's trying to achieve, and the role of FARs more broadly. It then talks to key concepts, because I'm very aware through my work, talking to loads of people, that this might not be a concept or a tool that they've come across through perhaps training or education, and even in their career, even if they've got decades of experience, because we haven't been using it more universally in Victoria. So walk through some key concepts so everyone can really get across what might feel quite unfamiliar. It walks through the benefits of FARs, and then it steps through these case studies that talk about the development outcomes that are delivered through those different development settings. And lastly, it concludes with how do you go about it? So setting effective FARs, what are the steps to deliver a really place-based response that will enable you to achieve all the things you're trying to achieve. So first of all, a key concept, and I'm sure there are people on the meeting call now who are also wrestling with or curious about what is a floor area ratio. So the practice note has a range of key concepts. I've just drawn one out for this, which is obviously the most important. What is a floor area ratio? And so you can see here that what it is it's a ratio between the amount of floor space that can be delivered on a site and the site size. So if you have a site size of 1,000 square metres, if you have a floor area ratio that is set at a ratio of 4 to 1, that means 4,000 square metres can be built on that site. Importantly, the FAR on its own does not tell you how to design a building. It doesn't provide any guidance on the specific building form. It just sets that floor area allowance. And so you can see here these 3 examples then on the bottom of the screen are all 4 to 1 ratios. There's a 4-storey building, an 8-storey building that's on half the site, or another typology, a podium and tower. All of those are 4 to 1. FARs do need to be mandatory to be effective. I'm quite unequivocal about that. The benefits that FARs deliver are undermined if they are not mandatory, which I'll talk through as I go. So there are 4 overarching key benefits of FARs. You can see captured here. So the biggest one, the most important one, is the certainty that FARs provide. So because they set the allowable floor space, they provide that certainty of yield. Therefore has a flow-on effect to these 3 other key benefits. So the first is that they deliver more livable apartments and neighbourhoods. And that's because with that allowable floor area set, the focus of the conversation and planning assessment and design work can really focus on, well, how does the designer take that floor area to design the best outcome for that site and also for that neighbourhood. It therefore enables a sort of generosity in the thinking of that design, whereas discretionary envelope controls, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, often there's the understandable starting position, because this is how they work, is that the developer has to seek to fill as much of that envelope as possible and even exceed the envelope. And so the designer has a much less flexibility on how they can then optimise the design for that site. They can support faster and more productive permit assessment processes. This is because the debate, again, and the process can shift from a push for more yield or a resistance to more yield, and that sort of tension that's inherent in all of those conversations, to a really clear focused conversation about how best can this yield be managed on this site and shaped on this site to deliver the best outcomes. They also support market efficiencies and a more longer-term viable development patterns. They do that by stabilising land value, by setting clear expectations between the buyer and the seller on how much their site is worth. They also facilitate the sale of sites because landowners aren't holding out thinking that they might get more later if perhaps adjacent developments get approvals for bigger and bigger developments. And so they actually set a sense of certainty in the market, and that supports that market efficiency. They also limit development speculation. There's no incentive to gamble on potentially getting more development on your site because the FAR really clearly sets that, which as I said earlier, that's one of the key things that rewards genuine developers who are keen to build rather than speculative developers who may be more focused on profits and perhaps flipping the site. So what outcomes can be achieved through the FAR? So the scheme I showed you earlier was just a scheme that has been developed up to illustrate the impact and outcomes of just discretionary envelope controls only. Whereas what you can see on the screen here is a scheme on that same sort of typical activity centre block where an FAR has been provided. And so what that is delivering is far more coherent development patterns where the whole block develops in a coherent, high quality way, both at the site scale and the neighbourhood scale. They sit better together. All apartments have good daylight and outlook to a street, a public space or a green space, which is obviously supporting healthy living. One of the key points I make through a lot of my work is that as we shift to higher density living environments, we actually have to make them desirable. We need people, the scale of housing we have to deliver as apartments, we need people to want to live in these places and these apartment buildings, not just to be seen as the only thing they can afford or the only option that they have. FARs support simpler and more efficient building forms, which supports feasibility and sustainability. That's because, again, the floor area can be shaped on site to achieve that outcome rather than filling an envelope. And you'll often get, we've all seen, for example, those wedding cake examples where more and more is packed in and where setbacks are reduced and there's sort of the geometry of the building, there's sort of a lot of gymnastics going on, which adds to the structural cost and also complexity of build and also future maintenance problems. They deliver neighbourhood benefits if used in the right way. So the example you can see here, there's a new neighbourhood park delivered on the large strategic site in the top right-hand corner. That's delivered through a floor area uplift alongside a community facility, creating a new community hub as this neighbourhood densifies. There's also a new laneway you can see that supports walkability. That generosity of that delivery of that laneway is supported because the developer isn't losing anything by delivering that laneway. They still have their yield. They just put it somewhere else on their site. We get more, again, above minimum requirements for things like deep soil planting and canopy trees, cooling the city and making them healthier and more attractive. And they can also be used to support the adaptive reuse of heritage buildings, again, because the floor area is controlled and, again, it can be adapted to accommodate the more greater retention of those buildings. And I've also noted on this example that FAU can be used to deliver social housing, so through an uplift, using that value capture mechanism to actually deliver some more public benefit. The method for setting FARs is also then outlined in the document. There are 3 overarching steps to this process. This has been evolved through my work on a number of settings particularly in Melbourne, but there's 3 overarching steps involved. And so the first is setting the overall place direction. That involves 3 key steps. The first, critically and importantly, is starting with the place and a place analysis. And the practice note talks to some of the key drivers that really influence the sort of scale of development that might be suitable in an area. And they include things like the site, the urban structure, the site characteristics, for example, the grain, the size, the shape and layout and orientation of sites. The other issues such as topography, heritage, broadly more neighbourhood character, interface issues such as responding to positive interfaces like a park, but also perhaps buffering from negative interfaces like a major roadway. So that place analysis is really key, setting the scene. Like the first thing we have to do, FARs, as I said, are just a tool. What exactly is it that we're trying to create? And that's where the place direction comes into place. The second part of that is really key, and I think this is something that we particularly miss out on in a lot of the work that we we sometimes do, which is really focusing on, well, if we are going to bring a lot more people into these places, they really have to be livable. And the quality of the public realm is really key to that. So we can't just keep bringing more people in. What does that mean for the existing streets and perhaps open spaces? Do we need new ones? Do we need new connections to make it more walkable? That has to happen early in the process. It's very hard to try and retrofit that later. So what are those key public realm enhancements? Which ones are really fixed and have certain locations to go in? Is there any flexibility on those? And connected to that, and I've highlighted this here because obviously it does particularly affect form and scale of urban development, is just then also thinking about sunlight protection. Are you trying to protect sunlight to streets or parks? Again, all of those things need to be established up front. Once that's done, the next step is identifying which building typologies, the scale of development that you're seeking, the character, and which building typologies are associated with delivering that. That step, because those buildings, I'll show you in a moment, have their own inherent attributes such as height and floor space, that application of those typologies effectively sets the initial envelopes and the initial FARs as arranged. So you're not starting from sort of nothing. Is the FAR going to be 2 to 1 or 10 to 1? Once you select those building scale and typologies, that then leads to an initial proposition for envelopes and FARs. Once that sort of overarching place direction is in place, then the next step is around the design testing. And this is a very iterative process. I've sort of expressed it very simply here, which is, you have to test the flow area ratios for local site conditions. That's a very simple way of thinking through all of those place-based nuances and specific attributes that might affect the flow area ratios and how they work. And then secondly, testing floor area uplifts, if those are being considered. The uplift is additional floor space above the base FAR. It's used to deliver those community benefits like social housing or like open space. If they're being considered, they all need to be tested in together. And then I've also flagged a parallel process here, which in my own work, particularly around developing built form controls in activity centres. We've done some of this ourselves, but often it's also done by others or in collaboration with others. And that's around capacity and feasibility testing. So capacity testing is about ensuring that the proposed development scale and the FARs are meeting any projected targets for that area around housing, but it can also obviously be for employment uses. The FAR enables very easy capacity testing because you've obviously got the floor space designated by the FAR and the site sizes. So it's very quick to sort of run numbers on that. And that capacity testing sometimes and can lead to a need to revisit some of the place direction. If, for example, the housing targets aren't being met, that might mean that you need to go back and actually revisit, well, have we got the building scale and typologies right? Is there more room to move here without compromising on the place direction? And feasibility testing is talking to the commercial feasibility of sites, like how ensuring that the development scale and the very specific site conditions, but also market conditions that are in that place are all harmonising together. And that is, those two are obviously important feedback loops to the broader design testing work. And then the last step is really the refinement and calibration of those FARs. So finalising those envelopes, FARs and FAUs against a set criteria, which is really about that achieving that place direction and any strategic objectives. An example of the typologies work that I was talking about, so this is a really key step in that setting that place direction, as I sort of just explained, is what is it that you're what is the place you're trying to create and what sort of building typologies suit that place. Blanketing an area with, say, a 16-storey height control when the sites are too small to support towers is a real disconnect, and then I think just continues to contribute to an incoherent development patterns or expectations and land value instability. So how do we make sure that we really connect real buildings, and importantly, this is a real, I think, paradigm shift in perhaps a more historical way when we're setting development controls, where you're just focusing on the public realm and perhaps the overall envelope and how it interacts with the public realm. This is making sure we're connecting it to real realistic, efficient and sustainable buildings, and rather than just an approach which sets the envelope and then leaves it to the later step where architects can come along try and sort of fill that envelope in the best way that they can. And as I said, this is the starting point for testing and calibration of FARs. So in a number of projects I've done, we have in our work started with an FAR, and this question often arises, well, where did that come from? Well, these development typologies have their own logical sort of range of FARs that relates to their scale, their height and their site size. And importantly, as I said at the beginning, it's just a tool. So what are we trying to achieve? That's what's really important. And so this graphic here shows you how we would then do the sort of objective analysis of how the different FARs are resulting and delivering on what we're trying to achieve. So this is just a simple mock-up to sort of explain how this works. So the list of objectives on the left, again, will come from your place directions or strategic directions for that area. They are crafted through the process and through setting that place direction. I've just included some examples here. And then the sensitivity testing in that iterative design testing stage, you might have the, say, mid-rise typology that you've selected. You know the range is sort of going to be sort of between 4 to 6. And so you can test that against those objectives. And in this example, you can see that once it tips up to 6 to 1, then actually some of those objectives aren't being achieved. The FAR is delivering a building that's too tall and blocking sunlight to street. Daylight is compromised. Soil, deep soil planting is compromised. Both the FAR 4 and 5 to 1 can deliver that, but the preferred FAR that would be selected is 5 to 1 because that's both optimising capacity and housing supply and optimising the design and strategic outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So hopefully that's been a really clear overview of the practice note, its intent and what it's trying and how you then go about using FARs. I'm just going to wrap up by just like really emphasising I guess a couple of key points that FARs aren't a silver bullet. They are a really important tool, though, that is proven and that can address many of the challenges that we are facing. It is why they're widely used across Australia and the globe. Supply and livability, where supply and livability are the goals. I'm not sure if others have had the same experience, but when you're sort of talking to others interstate or globally, like sometimes there's an extreme level of surprise that we don't have a mechanism for managing floor space because of all the ramifications it's had that I've just walked you through. But importantly, as I've said, all of these things, whether it's an FAR control, a zoning or a height limit, for example, none of them just produce good urbanism just because they exist or we put them in the planning scheme. All of it depends on where and how they're applied. And the real intent of this practice note is to share knowledge about how that can be best done and with an ambition that the adoption of these becomes more universal in Victoria because they can deliver the benefits that we are all trying to seek for our cities and neighbourhoods and our communities. So thank you.
Thank you, Leanne. That was fabulous. So good to hear you talk through that what is now a 40-page document so succinctly. And so I would encourage all of you to go to the Urban Design Forum website where you can now download the practice note and take a look at it for yourselves. The other point I'll just make before we launch into questions is that Leanne will be running a masterclass on FARs. It's tentatively scheduled for late July, so stay tuned for that. The Urban Design Forum will be advertising that very shortly. And I know a lot of people have joined the call since we started. I'm Rebecca Finn. I'm the current joint president of the Urban Design Forum. So thank you, Leanne, for that presentation. I believe that the Q&A chat has been open, or Q&A has been opened. The chat is not open, but you will be able to ask questions, which will be fed through to me, and I will be asking Leanne a series of questions over the next 20 or so minutes, and we will wrap up at about 5 to 1 so that you can all get on with your days. So, so the first question, Leanne, that we have for you, this might be an easy one, but if you could get one message, or we were talking about this earlier, one tweet, so therefore you have 280 characters, out to the broader urban design planning and development community about FARs, what would it be?
All right, great question. I think it would be that, I guess starting with the fact that, yes, they are a tool and they're a very useful tool when used well, a very compelling tool, and that they are a tool that can deliver quite a lot of the outcomes that we are seeking, and a proven tool to deliver many of the outcomes we are seeking. That was more than 280 characters. But I'd also say and this isn't quite answering your question, I totally get that they're an unfamiliar tool. And for people working in Victoria who've not used them, they may be a bit sceptical about why they're needed. But I guess I'd also say, just really be, I guess, curious about how these can work, because there is a good reason why they're used universally, and there is a good reason why they will deliver those same benefits in Victoria if we use them appropriately. So that's probably my overarching answer.
Absolutely, yes, it is. It's a newer concept for some of us in Victoria. The next question, which I know you touch on in the practice note, and that you didn't get a chance to talk about in the short presentation, but are there instances where the use of FARs is not appropriate? Do we use them everywhere, or are there times when they're not appropriate?
Yeah, no, that's a great question too. Look, they're definitely not like appropriate in all contexts. They have, I think, the highest benefit, particularly in higher density environments, particularly where there's high market pressure, because that's where we're seeing then discretionary envelope controls be under too much pressure and kind of fail. They also aren't that useful in locations where, for example, there's a really intact, high-valued heritage precinct where the preferred development outcome and design outcome is really clear, and you don't need to encourage flexibility, because there's, I guess, a paradox that I think people sometimes struggle with FARs is it's the mandatory nature of the FAR that actually enables flexibility, because you can then have freedom to sort of massage how that floor space is used. So in high heritage contexts, and if I take, for example, in South Melbourne, which we did the flow ratio, the built form controls recently, along Clarendon Street, where you have, runs of properties on the Victorian Heritage Register that are really intact, and it's really clear what you want. Utilising an FAR there is not really beneficial. A height control, and in that instance a mandatory height control, because it's of such a high heritage value, is actually the better tool. So it really is just about matching this tool to the outcome that you're seeking.
Okay, so thanks for that. There's questions coming in now. I will just ask one other question though, and Leanne, I know this is something you and I have talked about in the past, but setting building envelopes is comparatively easy to understand, easy to set, whereas setting effective FARs obviously requires some skill and time for those who haven't done it for as many years as you have and others. So if I'm a strategic planner sitting in a council somewhere in Melbourne and I want to use FARs, but I have a very small limited budget to engage consultants to do it properly, what advice would you give me?
Yeah, look, that's a great question too. And I totally acknowledge the challenges that different councils face in terms of perhaps time or resources, or perhaps pressures they're under just to deliver some work. So I guess what the practice note does is it outlines why you use them and the process for setting them up. There are, I guess, shorter and faster ways to do it if you need to, like particularly leaning into, and I've had to do this in the past where I was asked to, with my team, to actually look at what kind of FAR controls might be suitable for a place. So we were able to focus on particularly that place analysis and then that identification of building typologies. And so very quickly we were able to sort of at least start with this concept of a range. And then if you don't have time to do all of the testing, then it probably makes sense to choose the conservative end of that range. The lower end of that range, because that will then deliver a lot of the benefits of FAR still. You could then, for example, pair that with a floor area uplift if you then want to because you haven't had the time to test it, give perhaps more scope to therefore look at how individuals might optimise some floor area on their site and deliver that public benefit. There is also, I guess, it's also important to comment on the fact that some areas are easier to plan for and FARs than others. So if you've got an urban context where there's a lot of regularity to the urban form, to the urban structure, to the site size, orientation, and so on, you don't necessarily need to do a lot of testing. And so that can be quite quick. But if you have an area like, for example, South Melbourne again, it's so granular. It's one of our oldest urban neighbourhoods. You know, it's really granular and diverse across the things. So we had to do a lot of testing there to sort of really unpack that. So I guess you can match the resources and the time that you throw at it and still, I think, achieve a good outcome with FARs. Obviously, in an ideal world, you have the chance to really do it properly all the time, but I know we never live in that ideal world.
Yeah, okay, that's a terrific answer, and it does seem to, it comes back to context is everything, as you've made that point several times throughout the presentation. I'm just going to, so you knew that this question was going to be asked. So how do you balance FAR versus deemed to comply, which is obviously an incredibly relevant question here in Victoria right now?
Yeah, great, thanks. So I didn't mention, but the practice note, that there's 3 scenarios in the development outcomes section. One of them is the discretionary envelope that I've shown you and the FARs, and there is also a deemed to comply example as well. And so what that demonstrates is, I guess, some benefits of deemed to comply, and the practice note talks this generally about particularly potential fast approval times and perhaps, and obviously some certainty. But I think it's also important to note that deemed to comply still operate within a discretionary system. So as soon as someone starts to design outside of those deemed to comply controls, they're effectively back into the same sort of discretionary built form system that we're used to. There's no reason why an FAR can't work with deemed to comply, and obviously we're seeing that in some recent activity centre work and in the BFOs. So they can actually work together, but deemed to comply on their own aren't providing the same level of certainty that an FAR comply that can provide. And also, I guess, the 2 key points, I guess. One is how good the deemed to comply controls are is really related to how well considered they are. And again, this is referenced in the practice note at a point to say that, you know, if your standard deemed to comply controls, deemed to comply controls aren't set appropriately, they won't necessarily flow through to good quality design. They might flow through to past permits, but not good quality design. And the second point is, and this is what the case study that I've sort of tested in the report and the practice note shows, is on my assessment, adopting many of the deemed to comply controls that have been implemented in activity centres will lead to underdevelopment, because the flexibility isn't there to massage building forms for the specific site if you're just complying with these deemed to comply, particularly above 6 stories where those setbacks kick in. I think it'll actually, without any site amalgamation, it's just going to drive a lot of 6-story buildings. Maybe that's not the end of the world, but it won't necessarily achieve the outcomes that they think it is.
Okay, so that I've got 2 follow-on questions from that, which you sort of touched on here, but what would you say to developers who say that FARs might lock in the underdevelopment of a site, which is just the opposite of what you were saying?
I guess 2 things. I mean, any development control is in place in the planning scheme and can be changed. So they're not locked in forever. And if there is a reason to change how much floor space is allowed on that site. But I think this also comes back to perhaps a misunderstanding about FARs, is that they are sometimes seen as a cap on development, a sort of, if you like, a overly restrictive cap on development. But hopefully what I've sort of walked you through is, if they're actually set appropriately, then they actually are aligned with the development scale that's actually being sought, and they actually empower that development to be delivered, because they help from, as I said, a market efficiency point of view, or the flexibility that gives the designer to actually optimise the yield on that site compared to, say, deemed to control comply. So they, I guess, maybe that's my second tweet, if I can have one, is just shifting the mindset around this idea that they are a restrictive control. They actually, yes, they are and particularly the use of them as a mandatory control, they do set the floor space allowance, but they actually, if appropriately set, are actually aligning that with the development potential anyway.
And so I know as part of your research and your work, you have spent a lot of time talking to developers, and I'm sure a lot of us on the call were present at a couple of years ago or 18 months ago when you spoke to Chris Daff about FARs in a similar format to today. So all your conversations with developers around Melbourne and Victoria, do you get a lot of positive feedback from developers about FARs?
Yeah, look, I think it's mixed, to be honest. Like, it's obviously very mixed. Sometimes that relates to their level of experience with them. That example you just mentioned is a great one, and I think Chris Daff spoke to this so clearly in his presentation, and I'm not sure how many of the people on the meeting were there, but he very clearly talked about the fact that certainty is key for developers. Like, they don't want risk. They actually want certainty about what they can deliver. And that without that certainty of how much floor space is appropriate on a site, they have to fill the envelope as much as possible, because that's the only way to outbid other people who are trying to buy that land. So it all starts at the site acquisition stage, where any developer who's like looking to buy a piece of land is obviously doing their due diligence and doing some feasibility testing. With an FAR, that there's that certainty, a shared understanding of what that land value is worth between the buyer and the seller. Without that, then those developers are doing that feasibility testing to try and win that site, to outbid everyone else. They will, understandably, this is what I would do if I was them too. They will seek to put as much yield on that site as possible, as they think they're going to, if you like, kind of be able to get away with through the planning permit process. So this level of ambiguity is driving those. It starts there, where therefore you then get, if you like, a potentially locked-in outcome, because once they buy that site, that is then the floor space that they have to deliver for everything to stack up, because that's what they bought the site for. So everything from there becomes more complicated, and there's more tension in it, because there's a sort of, understandably, a defensive position from the developer for the yield that they need to deliver aligned with the site purchase value.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just going back to there's another question here that's come through. This sort of relates to the deemed to comply controls, but and you touched on it, but just more specifically, someone is asking, how do you see FARs interacting with the activity centres program?
Yeah, so I mean, this is super interesting, and I've obviously had some involvement with the activity centres program as well through my consultancy work. So some of the pilot activity centres have FARs in them, but most of them don't. Obviously, the tools that are being developed to support that program, like the built form overlay, has a allowance for using an FAR as well as an uplift scheme. So there is no reason why the FARs can't be incorporated into the activity centre program. I would strongly advocate that they are. They're exactly the sort of urban context where they will add a lot of value. So I'm going to probably just answered it. Like, they can easily be incorporated. The work just needs to be done to sort of calibrate those FARs into the proposed typologies for each place.
Yeah, it could be added retrospectively.
Easily, yeah. I guess I'd even go further into that to say I think that should happen, and it should happen sooner, because I think one of the other comments that I also have heard from developers, and again, this is totally understandable, is if they've purchased the site with the expectation of high yield because there was just the envelope and it's retrofitted with an FAR, like, that is obviously not a great outcome that anyone wants for anybody, because it'll stall that development as well. So setting them early and at the same time they really should be set at the same time that you're introducing any upzoning or uplift in envelope controls, and done in a coherent manner, but they still will deliver benefit if it's retrofitted, and I think that should be done. Yeah,
okay. So you're doing very well here. We've fired a lot of questions at you. It's probably nothing compared to being on a panel, but So just another question that again is in the practice note that that I don't think you didn't have time to go into today, but a concept that I think was really helpful for me. You talk about that relationship between building envelope and FAR, and you talk about the sort of a tight fit or a loose fit. And I think I found that a really, you've obviously had a lot more experience in this than I have over the years. And I found that to be a really helpful sort of concept. Can you just talk about that for a second?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So, so the question of fit it talks to exactly what you're saying, like the degree to which the floor space that is allowed by the FAR, the degree to which that, if you like, fills up the envelope. And so again, in a lot of the work I've done, and particularly a number of recent planning panels, there, I think, has been this misunderstanding that there's sort of like a Goldilocks fit that, that perhaps sort of, an 8-story building should always have an FAR of 6:1, which is a 75% kind of fit. And I guess what I've tried to illustrate through my work is that is a little bit simplistic, and actually you need to design the fit to deliver what you're trying to achieve. So there are examples, for example, if you have like an 8-story infill building that's party walled, the fit is usually quite close. You don't need a lot of flexibility in that design, in that development typology. You want some, but you don't need a lot. So that fit can be quite close. And the tighter the fit, the less flexibility there is in the design, in the design outcomes. But on larger sites and on sites that have tower developments, you need that fit will be looser, because tower developments need more space around them. So therefore the fit will be looser. And same on larger sites, when you start to get multiple buildings, or you get you need more communal open space or public space, then you need to leave room in the envelope, so to make to deliver those outcomes. And that can be, again, a very intentional decision, because for those who are familiar with the Macaulay panel recently, like one of the, and same with when I did the Fisherman's Bend work a long time ago, these are pieces of city where we are trying to really orchestrate a quite significant transformation from light industrial to a modern urban neighbourhood. And so you don't want to be too prescriptive. You're actually trying to orchestrate that diversity. So looseness of fit on very large sites really facilitate different height limit, different building heights all on one site, rather than sort of saying this site is meant to be 8 stories or 20 stories or 30 stories.
And this is the sort of information that's in the practice note that is incredibly useful. I mean, there are so many sort of tips and tricks the whole way through this practice note that I think a lot of practitioners and council planners and developers will find incredibly useful. There's one question here which I know you did touch on, but it's come up as a question, so I think it's worth asking. Should FARs be mandatory to achieve appropriate place-based outcomes? And I know that you did touch on this, but just, do discretionary FARs ever work?
No. Sure. Effectively, they start operating like a discretionary building envelope control, and with that, a level of elasticity that we see with building envelope controls, particularly in urban contexts where there's a lot of high market demand, the benefits of the FAR are lost because the certainty is lost, and so they should be mandatory. Recent research that I did with Andy Fergus, like I don't think we could find outside of Victoria another example where they were used as a discretionary control, for good reason, because they don't work. And I can put my hand on my heart and say I introduced one of those discretionary controls into Melbourne, and I would like to change that, in the Sturt Street areas, because I didn't know what I know now, which is that they have to be mandatory to work. You really do undermine all the benefits that FARs deliver if they're discretionary.
Yeah, okay. And that's quite clear in the practice note. I'm going to read out a longish question here, which I haven't had the chance to completely read yet, but Brendan sent it through to me. With the current push for FAR in the Victorian planning reform, does the good design outcomes can be guaranteed regardless of the developer or their consultant skill level? Or is the current system, or actually, let's just leave it at that. Does it depend, do good outcomes depend on the developer and the consultant's skill level in terms of FARs?
Yes, to some degree, but I guess far less than if you had just obviously discretionary building envelope control, because you haven't got as much, I guess, development to play with to go wrong. Of course, it still requires some skill, and I think, but I think the key point is it's setting the sort of starting conditions appropriately, so that then the design can be like massaged to sort of try and optimize design outcomes. And I think if perhaps a inexperienced developer or an inexperienced designer took that floor space and tried to design a building, they perhaps just can't go as wrong as the FAR was there. But I think the flip side of that question is it's really about empowering good designers to do even better work. And I'm sure there are many architects on the call who are frustrated by not being able to deliver the work that they want, because, again, there's just a market pressure to deliver additional yield on those sites, because of, again, as I've said, from site acquisition, that pressure is there all the way through.
Yeah. Okay. I know where it's 5:02, so we'll wind up in a second. There's one question here which we haven't touched on, which I think is worth touching on. How should floor area uplift mechanisms be used without compromising the guidance that FARs should be mandatory? What does testing FAUs look like?
Yeah, great. I'm really glad we fit in a question about FAUs. We haven't talked to them too much. So so again, I think some people sort of struggle with this concept, the idea that you have a mandatory FAR, but then you can go above it with an FAU. But I think the key point is that the FAR sets a ceiling or a threshold for potential additional yield. There's no guarantee you'll get additional yield if an FAU is in place. You'd have to demonstrate that you can actually deliver a good design outcome. And so they are very complementary, and again used around the world to incentivise the delivery of public benefit. The key, as I've sort of said, is making sure that the testing is done, and also two more things just quickly on FAUs is using them quite broad brush can be quite, I think, dangerous. They really are suitable for particular contexts, particularly larger sites and taller buildings where there is more room to potentially accommodate some additional floor area. On smaller sites or lower scale development, like say 6 to 8 stories, once you start, if you have an FAU, you can sort of accidentally, inadvertently, suddenly start tipping into a completely different typology for tower developments, because that's the only way you'll get that additional yield. So using them on taller buildings and larger sites, and also generally capping the FAU so it's not unlimited, and this is not the start, it's not the limit. It's really key. That's
good. All right, I'm glad that we got that question in, and I think there are a lot of questions here. We're not going to get to all of them. I'm sorry, but I think I would encourage you all to download the practice note today and take a look at it, and then consider signing up for the masterclass, those of you who are interested, next month. I think the thing that's come out of all these questions for me is that it's a toolbox of mechanisms and tools for us to use and consider in seeking good urban outcomes. The practice note is going to be an incredibly helpful tool for all of us. So, Leanne, I just want to say to you, thank you so much for today. Thank you for the time and effort that you've put into this. It's been it's a wonderful document, and we look forward to digging into it further. And thank you to all of you who joined the call. We appreciate your support and hope that you really got something out of today. So I don't think there's anything else that I have to say. We're finishing a couple of minutes before 1 o'clock. So I hope you can all get on with your days, and thank you for being part of this event as part of the UDF. Goodbye.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks, Beck.